Greetings. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the first of a series of 5 online conversations brought to you by the Foundation for Self-Leadership, so that we can explore together how we might build bridges across this widening divide between our people and our communities. Contributing to building such bridges, we all know, is a must. I am Tufiq Hakim, privileged to be serving as the Foundation Executive Director. On behalf of our board and our associates, I welcome you to this program. Our world, dear participants, is crying out for deeper healing, harmony, and peace. This reality reminds us of what many thought leaders and spiritual teachers have told us over the ages, that we cannot achieve the resemblance of peace in the world around us unless and until we establish some level of serenity, harmony, and peace inside our own minds and hearts. It all starts with us, and then it affects our relationships with others. And from there, given the multiplier effect, it will hopefully expand outwards. Clearly, the last few years have been most challenging for all of us. The pandemic, the politics, the needs for racial, social justice and equity, the human-made, triggered, or influenced disasters. It's been taxing in the US and all around the world, regardless of our political preferences, religious leanings, our economic or educational backgrounds, family legacies, or personal preferences, choices, or identities, or experiences even. For some, it's been excruciatingly painful, given devastating human loss and physical loss, health struggles, and financial pressures. Our hearts go out to you. Today's external conditions have evoked in all of us uneasy feelings and stirred up frustration and disbelief, especially in the face of irreconcilable disagreements around otherwise widely accepted, proven basic facts. As such, our interactions with others in our homes, at the workplace, physical or virtual, in our neighborhoods, have been very difficult, to say the least. I, for one, have experienced deep sadness. I have tried very hard to fend off cynicism and helplessness. I felt angry, furious, indignant. Fear of what might come stared me down squarely in the eye. And then I realized that I must come to terms with my own emotions, my own system of thoughts, beliefs, and assumptions. I must see them for what they are, perhaps there for a good reason, maybe just some elements of who I am, not the totality of who I am. I must look at them objectively, place them in perspective, lead them effectively, the way a loving, caring adult might guide a frazzled child. Only then, mind you, might I be able to muster enough empathy toward the other, enough interest in the other's experience, views, or issues. Only then might I find enough courage to initiate or engage in a civil dialogue with the other, or perhaps even the wisdom to step away without burning bridges, to use that metaphor, agreeing to disagree. At a time like today, my dear friends, when civility and dialogue, the cornerstones of our society, a society for the people, by the people, when civility and dialogue start to crumble, we're called upon to step up and do everything we can to preserve and protect human dignity, mutual respect, and caring kindness in the engagement with the others. Otherwise, optimism and hope in a brighter future will falter and fall into free fall, go into free fall, into the void. This, my fellow bridge builders, is the context for today's conversation. From fight or flight to dialogue, turning inwards toward a path to civility. And I'm deeply pleased to be introducing our two panelists today. David Medeiros, an IFS-trained psychotherapist in Rhode Island, an author of a recent book that was published just before the 2020 presidential elections, in which he interviewed the IFS developer Dick Schwartz and a number of lead IFS trainers. David was also the key advisor to a theatrical production inspired by IFS, A Good Grief, which some of you may have seen at the 2019 IFS conference or 2 months later in Boston. David, lovely to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Good to have you. And Vicky McCoy, whom we're very fortunate to have as our foundation board chair. Vicki is a seasoned communications officer and a leading organizational development and executive leadership advisor and consultant, who for decades, she started very early, has supported with effective guidance many federal agencies. Vicki, lovely to have you with us as well.
So wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. And Vicki and David, before you start, if I may, do a quick interlude, something different. What I failed to say is that David is in addition to all his talents and skills, is an inductee into the Rhode Island Music Hall of Fame as a drummer. And I'd like to start with a short interlude with David giving us a drum interpretation, a drumming interpretation, if you wish, of flight, fight, and dialogue.
This might be what fight sounds like. This might be what flight sounds like. This might be what dialogue sounds like.
Thank you, Tufiq.
Thank you, Tufiq.
David, that is just absolutely amazing. That's the drum beat we're hearing out in the world minus the drums, isn't it? What do you think?
I believe so.
So I want you to walk us through it, David. When we think about it, in the face of personal threat, we humans tend to go with some consistency either toward flight or fight. What's going on in our brains and in our bodies when we're in fight or flight mode?
Yes. Well, I mean, people that are familiar with the limbic system in the amygdala or in polyvagal theory is really a hijacking of our brain in going into those modes, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And the first beat that I played is actually from a fife and drum corps, which I originally started playing. And that's the sound of war. When that beat is played, there's no more dialogue, there's no more talk. It is war, and that is the only thing that's going to happen from that point forward. The second one is flight, which again is part of our limbic system, and it's really running away from threat. Often in a panic or just trying to escape. And then the last one is my interpretation of what dialogue might be, that rather than playing everything in this very, very regimented way, it goes in between the drums. It has different kinds of tempos and sounds and volume, and it has all of these different flavors in it. And to do that kind of thing, you really have to listen to others rather than the first one, which is really, you're not listening, it's just you're driving ahead.
Oh. So fight and flight, dialogue ends. And, I noticed that when you were representing dialogue, what was cool was it captured how sometimes the conversation gets really animated and other times it's kind of smooth jazz, right? And then it may get animated again. And so we sort of move back and forth with each other. But to me, that's the sound of people trying to create a pool of shared meaning out of their different points of view.
Yes, exactly. It really is, it's around civility, and certainly with IFS about being in self and being this core of who we are. And for those trained in IFS about the 8 C's and compassion and connectedness, it's being able to be in that kind of place and having a dialogue as compared to the first two, which are not.
Yeah.
Is trying to escape with your life or to go to war.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that's when we experience more connectedness to ourselves and to one another. We've got more compassion, we've got more curiosity. But I noticed, David, you use the word civility, and you've written a whole book on the subject. And I'd really like to ask you how you define civility and why does it matter?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was part of the impetus of writing the book, is that probably like Tufiq had mentioned, probably 2, 3, 4 years ago, really seeing civility really being altered in our country and many other places. And for the kind of work that I do, the concern that I had around that. And so the base definition that I used in the book was civility is merely refraining from rudeness or being polite in a perfunctory way. But that's a really rudimentary definition. And it was interesting because when I interviewed Dr. Dick Schwartz, he said right away, so that's a really managerial way of defining being civil. And I said, yeah, I agree. But later in the book, I define what I really believe is civility or a civil society. And that's a bit difference.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, how would you define?
Yeah. I really like the definition that you've given in the book, but I guess if I were to say it in my own way, and by the way, those of you that are out there are more than welcome to post your own ideas about how you would define it, and we'll take a look at those too. But if I were to express it in my own words, it would be about acknowledging and respecting the humanity of every person. And beyond that, it would be about including seeing them as a whole human being, rather than identifying them by a particularly noticeable or strong part or aspect of them. And to me, it's acknowledging the self, that it's the core of every human being. So I'm interested in the fact that you talked about your motivation in writing the book was seeing this rise in incivility. And I wonder if you could say more about that. Is there a way you would characterize what's going on out there in the world that is actually becoming part and parcel of so much of our discourse? Mm-hmm. I think we would define it as the opposite of civility. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, in dovetailing what you said, in that when I think of the latter definition of civility, I see it as a response to things. So I define it as that which occurs when people treat each other with dignity and respect and kindness, and also embrace the interconnectedness and inherent value of all human beings and the planet that we live on. Mm-hmm. So later it's going to that. But what happens, and what I've seen so much now, is that is something that's often been ignored, and we all have parts. We all have times where we are not civil. And it really brings me to the famous Mike Elkin, where one time, for those of you that know Michael, we have these things called Mikeisms. And there was one time where I was a teaching assistant in a group, and I really did a lousy job. And it wasn't my best moment for sure. And I went to Michael and I said, I was lamenting about how bad I was, and I got edgy in it. And Michael, in his way, said, David, he said, despite your efforts, perfection will continue to elude you. So in doing this, rather than having somebody be the other, and you have a different viewpoint, a different political viewpoint, religious, that it becomes, we're different than you, you're the other, we're right. And that's when civility really starts to fall apart, especially when it becomes a template for how people react, interact. And that's what I've seen more and more and more, that this template of civility, there's a template now to be uncivil or incivil, and it's becoming more and more widely accepted.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think most of us can reflect back on times gone by where there were certain ways of behaving with other people that simply would have been unacceptable. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So I guess where I would sort of like to talk with you a little bit is to ask you, so David, what happens if I'm talking with someone and their values are completely different from my own? If I want to be a civil person, do I put my values aside and just listen, or do I lean in on what I believe? What do you think?
Well, it's a big question. I can give some of my proverbial 2 cents. I don't believe that you would be putting your values aside in being civil or being part of a civil society. I think you would really hold on to those. But again, with Mike Elkin, it's not a Mikeism, but he taught me probably more so than any other, that when I'm not curious, I'm definitely in a part. I don't really care what that other person has to say or their viewpoint. I've already made a decision that they're wrong, and that energy really, really comes out. And that's usually the end of dialogue and or building a bridge. It doesn't mean, so go ahead.
No, please continue.
I mean, it doesn't mean that you allow someone to hurt you or harm you, or people that you know or do things to harm others. But being curious and being compassionate about those views is a very, very powerful thing. It brings a very different energy. And now in TV shows, newscasts, presidential debates, you see people talking over each other constantly, interrupting, not listening at all, hollering. It's a very different kind of thing. And it starts from a place of not being civil and not being in what we in IFS would say is the core of self.
Yeah, as you're describing that, David, it occurs to me that being a civil person really involves being able to be self-reflective in that moment and to be able to identify when a part has taken us over, and to be able to unblend from that, to be able to get into self, and that even silence in the face of somebody with different values could be a part showing up, right? A part just stonewalling the conversation. So I kind of like to share something with you that happened to me recently. Please. And see what your thoughts are on it. Maybe you want to give me some feedback. Maybe you have some ideas around this. I had a recent experience of incivility. So I went with my adult granddaughter late in the afternoon to a Rooms to Go to look for a sofa that she was after. And she works in healthcare, and I'm very careful about my own health. So she and I, both vaccinated, but we were masked up. And we were very happy to notice when we walked in the store that a little family that was coming out, the mother and father were masked, even the children were masked. And we walked in the store and we saw a big group of, it was late in the day, there were very few customers, but we saw a group of salespeople sitting around a table, all of them with heavy duty masks on, working on their computers. But the individual who bounded up to us had a paper mask and it was dangling under his chin. He was about 10 feet from us and he said, "Can I help you?" We said, "No, we're going to walk around and take a look at things." And after a time, we found something that we really liked. We were sitting there on the sofa talking about it. My granddaughter was giving serious thought to making a purchase. And this same gentleman came over and he sat within about 4 feet of us. And he sat down and said, "Can I help you now?" And I looked at him and I said, "I would be more comfortable if you would wear your mask." And he jumped up and yanked his mask up and said, "I am fully vaccinated." And he stomped off, never to be seen again by us. And it was a rather extraordinary experience. So I found myself reflecting in that moment. I felt like I was in the experience and watching it. And what was odd is my granddaughter and I kept talking to each other, but I was sort of frozen in place. Both of us were shocked. It was not, I thought to myself, if I had said, I would really be more comfortable if I could get a drink of water, I believe the gentleman would have bolted off and brought me, some water. Yeah. And so I also found myself, even while I was talking about a sofa, reflecting on, did I do that badly? Should I have done that differently? So I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, from what I hear, it sounded like it was entirely appropriate, and you asked it in a really what we call a self-led way, and not blaming or accusatory. That's my initial take. But I guess my thought would be, would you have done anything differently? If you had an opportunity?
Yeah. I really reflected on that, and I kept thinking of, could I have said something else? And what I ended up realizing is, I'm responsible for what's going on inside of me. I can't be responsible for what might have been going on inside of him. But one thing I would like, and I think I am doing differently now, is to recognize that when we're talking about hot button issues, to just be aware that these are the kinds of things that can cause responses or reactions that we don't expect. And after he walked away, I found myself curious as to what had happened. Given that he was vaccinated, I would have expected he would say, "You don't need to worry. I'm vaccinated, but I'll happily pull my mask up." And I never did see him again to get to be able to talk to him, but I wish I could have. I wish I could have followed up to just sort of chat with him and see, see what was going through his mind. But I guess my takeaway was that what I would do differently is probably more internal than external, right? And to be able to sort of think about that when I know that these are issues that people are struggling with and have very polarized and strong views about, sort of not to take for granted that because this gentleman was trying to be of service to us, that he would have received that information differently. What do you think?
Yeah, I concur. I also think, there's a balance point of, like, when I asked you, what would you do? What might you have done something differently? but there's kind of, it's not quite a danger, but I'll use that word. There's kind of a danger of if somebody's not acting civilly, that, oh, could I have said it differently? Could I, could I have done this? Did I dance around it? And there's times where, I mean, it's clear from what we've seen, especially things like in January 6th, that there are times where people have made, or a part has made a decision not to be civil. And that's, people have dug into that particular place. So I think the question is valid, but also not so much though that we take the responsibility for somebody else's system.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. Well, David, that example was with a stranger who I'll probably never see again. But what do we do when we find that others, perhaps in our own family, our circle of friends, don't share our views on civility? Then where are we? That
is the really, probably for many people, if not most, that's among one of the most difficult things now, is what happens when there is a polarized view and there's a polarization of that. And when people are not willing to listen to the other viewpoint or have an unshakable conviction about their particular viewpoint. And that gets really more and more. As a therapist, I hear about families now that are having trouble getting together for holidays in all kind of religions and cultures because of that kind of division. That's why IFS, and I really included it so much in the book, because it gives us a way to navigate around these really sophisticated and complicated interactions. And if you can distill it, the idea about being connected, compassionate, curious, the courage to stand up for your convictions, but also be able to hear the other side of it. That's a gift, I believe, especially now.
Yeah, I think
Vicki
so.
And David, there's a question from Mark. Thank you, Mark, for your question. The interpretation of the question is, our civic leaders, especially in the past few years, have modeled uncivil behavior.
Yes.
Right. So they almost made it a part and parcel of what's accepted anymore. Right. Maybe a certain portion of our society does accept it. How do we deal with these situations? Might you comment on the reality that we live in?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest things that one of the points I really want to illuminate is voting, and how voting powerful voting is. We've seen now where usually people could be were civil or even part of a civil society, but we've seen more so in the last 4 years people who really model the opposite. I'm actually going to be uncivil, and that's part of my aura or power, and I'm going to show you how powerful it is. And it's a really, really difficult thing, because there are many people that really take the lead from our leadership and our politicians, and they model that behavior. So I believe that what we can do is around voting is really thinking about how important civility is, compassion is, because if not, then now we have a model now in our country where there are Congress people that have actually called other people in Congress a CUN, you know what, but they didn't spell the word. And that would be almost unimaginable years ago. And now it's kind of like, oh, well, that's what they do. Very, very personal attacks, putting people in danger. So I think one way that we can really, hopefully, potentially shift that is how important our vote is.
So David, I'd like to lean in a little bit more on this conversation and tie it back to some of the things you've said in your book. I do have lived long enough to remember when incivility became a political strategy, and could name the names of those politicians or their spokespersons who introduced incivility as a means of winning elections. And that's a whole topical area we can get into, but I want to tie back to what you said about the implications of people of influence, such as national leaders, such as our president, embracing incivility and its impacts on society and those they influence. Say a little more about that. I really liked in your book that you had examples of presidents from each party and even a vice president and what their uncivil behavior, the impact it had on followers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this goes back to some of your questions, Mark, and thank you for that. I wrote about President Trump and especially what happened in the first presidential debate, where, and I am an independent in terms of voting. I'm neither Republican or Democrat, but that was an example, and actually Dick Schwartz commented too, that that was a really low point for the lack of civility of constantly talking over somebody. And that was actually the strategy. The strategy was to interrupt so many times that the person couldn't really express their viewpoint, even if you disagreed with it. And at that point now, the president he did this thing where he said, now here's the deal, because he really needed to filter out what was coming constantly and interrupting the train of thought. Probably more impactful for me was working in domestic violence. And I have worked with over about 800, usually men, but women as well, that were convicted of domestic violence and were sentenced. And I had an agency that we would do domestic violence groups, psychoeducational groups. And in them, in the time of Bill Clinton, the men would identify a bunch of behaviors, and we would have a consensus with the group that these would constitute abusive behaviors, and that the men would identify that when they did their weekly check-in. And one of the things was having an affair, cheating on their partners, putting them at risk for venereal diseases, breach of trust, those kinds of things. And the men, even though they had been all convicted of those crimes, they all identified, yes, that would constitute abuse. And this was in the time where Bill Clinton was impeached. There was the Monica Lewinsky piece. And what happened is the men stopped identifying that that was abusive behavior. And I was curious. I wasn't doing IFS at that time, but I started asking the group, why aren't we talking about this? And several members said, well, you say it is. And I said, well, you agreed. They said, but yeah, but if the president can do it, why can't we? And I could feel the shift in the group that really that person and it kind of ties into Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority, of the influence of it. But for them, it was like, why should I be held to a higher standard than the president? And that was it. Those people were lost after that. And that really resonated with me back then, and how influential people that are in leadership roles have. Does that kind of answer?
I think that's huge. I think that's huge. And I also think it ties to the fact that every one of us is an influencer of someone. And so if we're going to have a civil society, we're going to have to be civil individuals, and we're going to have to carry that civility in us, which implies that this idea of paying attention to where the leadership of ourselves is coming from really matters in the moment. And when we are triggered, that's an easy time, especially with the people that we know we have influence with. We know we have influence with the people closest to us. And that really is an opportune moment to go in the wrong direction when we sort of let parts that are in extreme states of emotion have their sway. And then it does become, I could have easily imagined one of my children or my grandchildren saying, well, if she, behaves that way, why shouldn't I? And so it then becomes this perpetuating thing. what do you think happens inside of people? Because we're observing this out in the world, that people are taking, it would almost seem a vicarious pleasure in the incivility of some of these political leaders. I know in my state, we have a member of the House of Representatives who is specializing in being uncivil. And there sometimes seems to be an aspect of this that people are enjoying. And I'm wondering if you can relate that, as a psychotherapist, to what's happening with parts, because that can happen with us too. We could, I might see her get her comeuppance, and then there are parts of me that take pleasure in that, right? Mm-hmm. So what's going on with our parts when we're connecting to this bad behavior?
That's an interesting question. I would say a couple of things. If we looked at parts and we looked at some of the psychotherapy piece of like identifying with the aggressor in a family system, sometimes you have a choice. Am I going to be the person that's going to be overpowered and steamrolled by this person who's not going to be civil and is yelling, screaming, or talking over me, not listening, or violence, as we see more so now, quite frankly, by white supremacist groups or that kind of ilk. So a lot of times people will say, geez, I don't want that to happen to me. So if I do that, it's going to be harder for someone to do that. That's a common family dynamic. I also think there's something, because we are human, and I think that's kind of why sometimes or I'll say myself, like we're drawn to sometimes some of these arch villains in movies, because they do these horrible things, and yet they don't have any worry about it. They don't stay up at night. Like if you think of like the Joker and Batman and things like that, they blow up buildings, they walk away. And I think there's something in there about what's it like to not really care about what effects it has on others. Mm-hmm. There's something really freeing about that in some way, where you don't have to look inside. So I think those are some of the factors that play out in that.
David and Vicki, we have a few comments from a number of folks, and I'm just going to take a couple for you to entertain. One is profound and philosophical and goes to the core of the notion of self in the internal systems model. And it's coming from Nicholas. And Nicholas is basically asking or questioning whether the notion of civility itself is coming from a part that has a belief about what civil is and what isn't. And he's actually not convinced that self can be put into a box like that. So would you comment on that? Thank you for your question, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And I think that question comes up around a lot of things that we do. I often think that if I'm being civil, am I actually, is that a managerial part that is acting rather than self? And I think the key thing here, I don't know that I can give a definitive answer on that. I always go back to Dick Schwartz's 8 qualities of characteristics of self-leadership, the qualities that seem to display in us. And I'll just read them off to remind us: confidence, calmness, creativity, clarity, curiosity, courage, compassion, and connectedness. And so to the degree that civility displayed in us manifests in these ways, I would think that civility is a self-led way of being, but I think that it can also become a part very quickly. And I'll give you an example of something I reflected on. When I was thinking about the gentleman in the Rooms to Go showroom and my response to him, and I was wondering whether I could have done it differently, I've played in my head different things that I could have said. but I began to realize that I was going to rely on my more charming part, not my, agendaless part that's simply asking for, making a request about safety, but could I have manipulated him better? And when I reflected on that, I thought, I don't want to be that. That's not what I want to manifest. I want to be able to be straightforward and then remain curious if someone responds in a way or reacts in a way that shocks me. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I guess that's how I would look at it, that self-leadership is not something we can absolutely put our finger on, but we can describe the qualities of it. And is that what is coming out of us? Is those characteristics in our behavior, and being able to reflect on whether or not, parts are jumping up and taking over even in the midst of that if things don't go as we expect.
Yeah, and related to that, let me just read Rebecca's question, and David, maybe you can attempt to answer it. It relates to it in the sense that, at what point does compassion and, self-preservation or survival compete with each other? She's asking a question regarding COVID and the health directives and some people not complying with them that threaten our own health. At what point do we stay compassionate for the other, and at what point do we take a stand and protect ourselves? I mean, this is one symbolic example of what's going on in the world around us on a number of fronts.
Real life question.
Yes.
And can I just back up to the previous question as well? I just want to say that, and I had, as it was being asked, I was like, make sure there's not a part for me that's like being defensive. And but I want to share something that when I interviewed Dick, because he obviously, those of you that know him, he can get right to it. And he said that his opinion was that civility just naturally occurs when we're in self. So that was really influential, that when I defined it at the end, when I said that which occurs when people treat each other, so on and so forth, that it's a result of something rather than being in it. So for the next question, it's about what do you do when someone isn't being either civil or wearing a mask or social distancing? And that's a really difficult one because I work in threat assessment and risk management. I've studied with Gavin DeBecker in California, and I work with people who are being pursued, usually women, that people are trying to do great harm, including murder. And I work in that sphere. And the idea about having compassion for somebody, it's okay to have compassion for someone and say, oh, I maybe can think of where they're coming from or what they're doing, but it's not that you're setting yourself up to be treated poorly or hurt or harmed, that you can speak up. And like Vicki did with the person about the mask, being compassionate doesn't mean you abdicate your value system or the protection of yourself or your family. It means that at times you may have more of a sense of maybe I could enter into a dialogue or not. And so, for instance, in January 6th, there was no dialogue. For those Capitol and Metropolitan police officers, there was actually some compassion because, ironically, while you heard all the things swearing, telling we're going to kill them, I've looked at hours and hours and hours of video. I haven't seen one Capitol police officer yelling and screaming, "I'll kill you, I'll do this." There was even maybe some element of compassion in there, even though very few people would fault if they did say such a thing.
Yeah. May I ask a question? Sorry, go ahead, Vicki.
I remind myself that one of the descriptors of being self-led is courage. And there are times when that's the part of self-leadership that needs to be out front, the courage to confront something that is wrong or inappropriate or needs to stop, and being able to do that without hesitation, to say, this is not okay, this needs to stop now. So I don't see that as not being self-led, and often compassion will follow depending on the response to that, or the courage has to be sustained to quell whatever disturbance or violence is underway.
Vicki, could you stay on that point a bit more and elaborate, maybe share an example, a thought about what courage might look like? This is inspired by Erica's question, which really is dovetails with what you're saying. How does one turn self-energy into some spiritual bypass in these difficult moments? And then Andrea asked questions about issues sometimes confronting, certain police officers who might be errants or who might be angry and that sort of thing. What does courage look like in these situations?
It's such a fascinating thing, and I'm not going to put myself out there as being the person that's figured this all out. We're figuring this out together, aren't we? But I will say this about my own experience. So I had noticed that in many situations that I found myself in where I was really bothered about behavior, and it wasn't violent behavior, but it was the classic definition of violent communication that Rosenberg talks about in his book. And finding myself, the closest I could come to being self-led was not launching on another individual, okay? And I won't even call that self-led, that's probably manager-led. But having such a battle inside me of my parts that just staying silent was kind of a private victory. But I also realized over time that there's something called discounting the future. And discounting the future means I'll take the benefit of the immediate safety over the long-term impact of what I'm not speaking into. That's one way of explaining discounting the future. And so recently, I'm not going to lie to you, I probably spent a year biting my tongue. And more recently, I realized that I was doing a disservice not only to myself, but to others, including others that I really cared about, including my own, community that I really care about, my own nation. And so I've had to dig in and remind myself that courage is part of being self-led. And so I have found myself speaking into issues. The mask issue was one of my first forays, but also talking about some hard political things with members of my family, and actually being surprised that I was able to do so, and that we had some real dialogue about it. But this is the wrestling match inside us, isn't it? Our parts will be not in harmony. They'll be arguing with each other. I don't know about you, but especially if I watch the news before I go to bed at night, I noticed one time that I went to bed with my parts in arguing, and myself, there waiting to be accessed, but my parts kept rising up, went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and the same argument was still going on. So it must have happened all during my sleep as well. So these are the real challenges that we have. But I think you can start with courage at any level that you're willing. It doesn't have to be that you would be, the police officer out there battling others who are trying to do harm. It could be just having that conversation that is needed in service to your own greater good, in service to our own self, capital S and small s, in service to the self that exists in others, and in service to the community and the community we're trying to build.
There's a question from Jory. Thank you for bringing it up. She'd like you to speak to the cultural relativity of civility and what happens when conflict arises due to cultural differences. Is civility, a universal view does it change from culture to culture? How do we adapt among these various cultural views?
No. David, do you have thoughts about that?
It's a necessary component. Simple things like I'm Italian and Portuguese, and oftentimes being Italian and Portuguese, we can, certainly my Italian family, we can talk that close to each other. In many cultures, that is verboten and is an invasion of space. I've worked with numerous cultures, and oftentimes I'm ignorant in the true sense of the word, that I don't know about their culture, and I let them know that. And I really go about them teaching me about what's acceptable. I've worked with numerous people from Cambodia, and direct eye contact for them is or the people I've worked with, is a very dangerous thing with any type of authority figure. So it's an integral part of working with culture and trying to understand where that is. I believe they still come from the same base principles, whether the 8 C's or the principle of dignity and respect, or do unto others that they would have them do unto you. But there are all of these different ways of being culturally sensitive, and it really is essential, especially now in our country and the world.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, Jory, this is where curiosity comes in, doesn't it? Because we're not all, educated about other cultures that we may encounter and what matters to them. And so being able to see the humanity in another person and see them in their wholeness, including that they have a cultural background different from our own, could lead us into conversations where we develop a deeper understanding. I had a situation with a client that was actually a very close friend. She was a young woman, and she was of Chinese descent, and actually was born in China and brought here by her parents. And when a lot was happening during the early stages of the pandemic, and there was very uncivil and really cruel words being spoken, terms being used, and actually actions being taken, I was concerned about her, and she and I would get together just to chat about personal things apart from work. And I remember the difficulty. I kept kind of beating around the bush with her, trying to be careful that I wasn't too bold in what I was saying. I would say things like, "How is your family doing? How are your family in China? Are things going okay?" And I wasn't certain at all whether I was being appropriate, inappropriate, but she would just say, "Oh, everybody's fine." And then we had a conversation one day, and I don't know why I asked it, but I said to her, "I'm really worried about what's going on in the community that you live in Washington, D.C. And I'm wondering, how are you? Is this having impact on you?" And I was actually that bold, and outpoured a torrent of emotion on her part about what they were going through. And a shocking revelation of this young woman saying, "Never in my life has my family owned a gun, and we own a gun now." And so I can't be an expert on cross-cultural communication. Some of it we need to learn, some of it we need to feel our way. But actually, Tufiq, I'd like to invite you into this piece of the conversation to see if you have any thoughts that would be helpful to Jory and others.
I think you said what needs to be said about listening and willing to learn, and really examining our own beliefs, and having the open-minded curiosity that both of you referred to. We're all a product of our biographies, of our experiences, of our family cultures, and we see the world through that lens. And the world is not one lens, it's a prism. So we have to be able to break that light into all its beautiful components. And that's a long, process. It's a lifelong process. And as long as we're humble enough to admit it, and not to think that if I lose my way, the whole world falls apart. You know, by losing my way a little bit, I'm gaining a whole lot from the other person's way. And I think that's where the dialogue occurs. And that's a great place to have a dialogue these days with all that's going on in our world.
You bring up such a great point, Tufiq, and that's the idea of being humble. Because the thing that I've realized in traveling, I grew up overseas in the Republic of Panama, and traveling around the world, you realize that everybody loves their country. And when you begin to take that in, that everybody feels that love for their birthplace, then you stop thinking of yourself as, quote, the greatest nation on earth, and which many cultures find so offensive, right? And we can talk about our ideals, and that we have some wonderful ideals, but then we better bring the humility to bear on whether or not we're living up to them, and look at the ideals that other cultures bring that are of value to us. That's been my own experience, to celebrate how other people see the world in ways that makes great contributions. Growing up in Panama, I learned that you could sit in front of a meal and not be totally immersed in conversation where you didn't know what you were eating, but Panamanians taught me that you could emote over the rice and how beautifully prepared the rice was, and have a whole experience of being in that moment. Well, that's not part of my culture, but I learned it.
Well, I'm glad this question came up, because it took us a little bit beyond the US-centric point of view. I mean, I'm an immigrant, and you know, my heart is big enough to love two nations. You know, yes, I have you know, taken an oath to support the place here where I have built a family and a life. But from the very first days of my arrival here, I struggled with this notion of US centrism. You know, we're a continent, we're separate from the world, it seems sometimes. And besides the Civil War and other, you know, civil unrest issues, we haven't really appreciated what it means, you know, to be in a developing country, to struggle every day. And I think that humility, that willingness to understand the other, will shake us out of our own artificial comfort. And I think that's an important piece. And that's an important piece for civility, because as long as we have, or we think we have the upper hand, as long as we think that we have the answers, we have the solutions, we're the brightest and the best, you know, the notion of civility is already moot and broken really at the gate. There's an interesting question from Glenn, and I appreciate your comments, Tara and Mose, and I see some other questions. He will try to address them, but there's a very interesting question that is fit here, because Glenn is suggesting that there must be some notion of collective self. You know, he's saying, what are the thoughts about self and parts of a community or a nation, or even the world, I would add. And from this perspective, might we look at civility from a higher level? What are your thoughts?
Well, when my definitions were a confluence of a lot of different influences, but some of them were Ann Cinco, Rena Dubin, Mike Elkin, and Dick Schwartz. And it was Ann that talked about the interconnectedness, and that's why that word found its way into my definition of civility, because we are interconnected. You're right, we are isolated in terms of the continent, but I do believe that we are part of a collective, especially now with the world pandemic. And that intrinsic value that we have is also an intrinsic value of the collective. And I added the planet that we live on, because I don't think it's possible to be civil and not respect the planet that we live on and treat it well. So I do believe there's the bigger piece in all of this.
You know, it's interesting when you raise this question, my immediate image in my mind was the experience of being in a very huge group that was singing together And very often, like for the Christian Easter, people will come together in a stadium, and there'll be music and feeling that collective self energy is what I would call it. Just a connectedness to everybody around you, just from the experience of singing, just from the experience of music. And I imagine that lots of people have had that feeling. So it's easy for me to then extrapolate that there is a collective self that we can tap into. So how do we do that? How do we create the conditions for that? I worked with a team one time that was coming together to discuss a pilot project. And I knew that a couple of the people that were coming to the meeting, they were in leadership roles, were coming, as the expression goes, loaded for bear. And so I front loaded the agenda with an experience that brought us back to a more centered place. And I absolutely watched a group transform its energy just from 5 minutes spent centering around shared values. And so there's something there that we can do. And I can't change the world, and neither can you, but I can bloom where I'm planted. I can be a purveyor of peace, a generator of hope in whatever circumstance I find myself in. So the pragmatic part of me recognized what was potential, and what came to me, perhaps, self-led, was this idea of getting the group centered before it even began its deliberations. So does that apply to much larger groups? I would like to think so.
Thank you. There's a question from Joanna, who, as both of you know, is working a lot in the schools, bringing notions of parts and self-leadership to schools. She'd like to know what your thoughts are on how we inspire, coach, and teach civil self-led action among young people in particular, and possibly for teachers and parents. Thank you, Joanna, for the question. And for being with us.
Yeah. Can I?
Please.
Well, I happen to know Joanna, and she's a rock star. And just the parallel is that oppressive regimes know that you start with the children, and that in Hitler's, the Hitler Youth Movement in Cambodia and other oppressive regimes, they start with children, and it's an indoctrination. It's not education. And I know Joanna and several of the things that she's doing, and teaching kids at this particular level the kind of things that she's teaching about integrating self-led and mindfulness. I don't want to speak for her, but what a gift for children to be able to have these kinds of tools in their toolbox at this early age, and giving them choices about what conflict resolution is, what it's like when you can disagree, can reasonable people disagree, or kids. It's just a beautiful thing. And I know that she's been working on it for quite some time and has some things up and coming.
Joanna, I have to say that what proved to me the tremendous value of us taking IFS into schools was what happened to me on a personal level. After I went to level 1 training, I came back and I sat down with 2 of my grandchildren. I was babysitting them, and I explained to them a little bit about the self and parts paradigm, and I had them do the mapping of parts exercise. And I'm trying to think how old they were at the time. They were probably, one was 10 and one was 12. And I saw these 2 children immediately be able to draw their parts. It was amazing how quickly they understood the concept and were able to identify their parts. I always remember it because my grandson had a part that was his happy-go-lucky part, and it was a stick figure of him with musical notes. He was singing in the shower. Isn't that great? And And so this idea of taking this to children, to being able to introduce people to this at an early age, to me is just critically important. To be able to know that when you're angry, that anger isn't all of you, that there's more to you than that part, to me is just of huge value. And to be able to distinguish those parts and to become the observer, the self-observing, the part acting out. What more beautiful gift could we give to our kids than that ability to be self-aware and to make choices out of that self-awareness? I can't say enough about my commitment to that idea.
Thank you. There are two questions actually that deal with racism and white fragility, and I know there's the third and the fourth conversations. Sharon and Andrea will deal with those issues. However, we can maybe pose the question here. So how do you show civility in the presence of a person who displays racist behavior? And is white fragility, I mean, how do you deal with that? When is niceness then become a part versus self? So just share some thoughts around these two topics. And thank you, Andrea and Sharon, for your questions.
Thank you, Andrea. You want to go ahead, David?
Well, I guess I'll be speaking from the outside in. When I saw the congressional hearings with critical race theory, and this is an intersection, I do believe that, and I'm not speaking for IFS or Dick Schwartz, but I do believe that anger can be self-led. And when I think of like Martin Luther's famous speech, which I think is probably one of the best speeches ever on the planet Earth, my impression, he's angry. He's not happy about what's happened, but he's taking that energy in a really transformative way. When General Mark Miley was questioned about critical race theory and whether it was being taught at West Point in the Naval War College, and he just did, I just think, a really a beautiful job of. He talked about, and I'm paraphrasing the first part, but he said, "What's so wrong about wanting to have a situational understanding of what's happening?" And it was such a beautiful question. It was never answered by the congressman that asked it. And then just the idea that you would think about that became a conflict. And he said, "I personally find it offensive accusing the United States military, general officers, commissioned, non-commissioned officers of being, quote, woke or something else, because we're studying some theories that are out there." And after that, they panned to the congressman, and he was smirking, rolling his eyes, making these rude gestures. And that to me was an example of how to be civil, not on the street, but in that kind of setting. When I see Jen, I believe you pronounce it, Psaki, the White House press secretary, she's another person that really embodies, I believe, civility or civil. My understanding in reading articles, she doesn't like to be described as being nice. She's a very, very strong, assertive person, but not about race necessarily, but about the questions of race. I believe that they're two, or those three people are national examples about what it's like in having a discussion about race. Face to face, that's a different thing if you have a white supremacist group and they're bent on hurting you. That's a different thing.
We have just a few minutes left, David and Vicki. Before I close, I'm wondering if you can have each the final word of this conversation. And I know there were some other comments and some requests for a script to invite children and family members to draw parts. Please stay tuned, Ro. We'll figure out how to get that information to you.
Vicki, would you like to go first?
Well, and these are closeout comments, Tufiq?
Yeah, and then I'll close the session.
Okay. Well, it's I just want to make a comment about the idea that anger can be self-led. I was grateful for Dr. Fauci getting angry at a senator and speaking in no uncertain terms to the senator when he was misquoting him and manipulating his words and actions. So I think there is a place for being very clear on where we stand on something, and it doesn't have to be done in a way that ends dialogue. We can stay open. You can bet that Fauci is still ready to speak to Rand Paul, right? But he also, was very firm with him, and there's just so much we could say around the issue of race, and I just want to share one little story. My grandson, who's 16 years old, was at my home putting something together for me. And he looked up at me at one point and he said, "Grandma, what do you think about this Black Lives Matter movement? I mean, don't all lives matter?" And this is what I said to him: "Ryan, if you're in your car riding down the street and your friend Nick, who happens to be African American, is riding down the street in his car, and you're both 5 miles over the speed limit, and the policeman stops you in Monroe, Georgia, where you live, who's in the biggest trouble?" And without even missing a beat, he said, "Nick." And I said, "Ryan, that's why Black Lives Matter." And Ryan said, "Oh." So I think we owe it to ourselves, to our children, to our country, to find our courage and to do it in the most self-led way we can, but also to confront it if it's something that needs to be confronted in a very strong way to stop it. So I guess my closing comment would really be that I believe in practicing proactive civility. And that's something that I've been reflecting on lately. We have so many people that are in vulnerable situations around us, so many people that are helping other people. I take advantage of having people do my shopping for me on Instacart. And I have communication back and forth with this individual who's trying to do their best to serve me. And one of the things that I have decided is I will call them by their name. They write me a note and I write them back and I call them by their name. I thank them while they're shopping for what they're doing that is particularly helpful, that I appreciate that they've tried 3 times to get what I'm looking for and they've finally found it. And so for me, that's something that all of us can think about in this time that is so high stress for people. Can we be civil, not just as a response, but can we be proactively civil, recognizing the humanity of others, looking people in the eye, calling them by their name, expressing gratitude for who they are and what they're doing in our world.
David?
So I have two things. I wrote this book. It was really important for me to publish it before the election because in the world of either threat assessment and risk management, having a predictive ability is really, really important. And I really felt like we were headed for some very, very tough times, bad times, catastrophic times. But it would have to be like the butterfly effect, like there would be a wave in Taiwan and it would affect somewhere in Rhode Island in terms of the election. But I really wrote it is because I wanted a way to explain in a non-shaming, non-blaming way how so many people could embrace a lack of civility, a polarization, becoming it's us versus them. And I really wanted to do that in a way. And I think that IFS is the exquisite vehicle to do so, but I included some other ways as well, because not everything fits for one person. But that was really the impetus for writing the book, is what I predicted would happen, or what I felt would happen after. The last part I want to just say is voting is so important. And I just want to keep going at that. And again, I'm not Republican or Democrat. I do vote for civility and ethics and those kinds of things, and what I believe is more self-led. But there was a 7 million difference in the voting. But what really happened, it was only a difference of 80,000 votes in what you've seen about the swing states that made the difference in this election. That was it. And the battle is not for the popular vote, it's for the electoral votes. And I believe that's why we're seeing so much voter suppression in this torrent, this tsunami of laws going to limit that, especially for communities of color, other kind of socioeconomic values. So thinking about voting, supporting the community, supporting the people, that the vote is so important. It really makes a difference, because it was only 80,000 votes that made the difference in this election.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both so very much for a very engaging conversation. Deep insights, practical tools, examples of everyday interactions, a lot of takeaways. One for me, a reminder is we're only responsible for our own thoughts, for our own actions, for our own reactions and responses. And that's where civility probably starts. So I want to thank you very much for being with us. I want to thank all the participants.